Hey everybody, welcome back to the second half of the lecture. I want to apologize for the lack of audio in that video. Thought I had my settings right, but I guess I didn't. Sherry will share with all of you the link to that YouTube video, which I was just showing you a segment of. And the purpose of that was I was discussing this idea of how, right, you're conscious of some things, but there's actually a lot of unconscious processes happening in your brain. And this video goes into a little more detail and has some cool examples of that. So I do recommend you go and check it out. Overall, it's a 5-minute video. It won't take much time. But let's continue on talking about some real experimental evidence to this idea that there is unconscious processing occurring in your brain. So one example of this is in the case of blind sight. And individuals with blind sight often have damage, maybe due to a stroke, to their geniculostriate pathway, right, a visual processing pathway. And these people will lack conscious awareness of objects that's in their damaged visual field. And I say damaged visual field because you have a right and left visual field. The subjects will usually respond correctly when asked to point out an object, although they have no conscious recollection, or they do not know that they're seeing an object. In this little cartoon example, there'd be kind of a bubble right before where the researcher's saying, "Tell me what you see." And the person says, "But I'm blind. I can't see any stripes." And the researcher says, "Well, just have a guess. Just try." And the person says, then I guess horizontal red stripes, right? So there are real examples of this. Most of the time it involves pointing out things, right? Pointing to something like a circle out of a bunch of set of square, a bunch of set of shapes or something. But this is real. And again, showing that you can lack your conscious awareness of something, but your body, right, we can measure and see that it can respond to something as if it's still perceiving it. You're just unaware of it. It's crazy, right? Another example is in prosopagnosia. This is a condition, you may have heard about it before, where people have damage to a particular area of the brain called the fusiform face area, sometimes called the fusiform face gyrus. And it's the area responsible for facial recognition. These individuals with prosopagnosia will lack conscious awareness of faces. For example, you could put a picture in front of this person of their mother or father, right, their family, and you can have another picture of strangers, right, people they haven't ever encountered in their life, and they will think everyone in all the pictures are strangers, right? They will not be able to recognize their mom or their dad, despite that they can see a person's there. It's like they can't access the memory, or they don't have any conscious recollection of who it is. And you could at first glance say, okay, these people just can't recognize faces. But there's a little more to it, because if we show them, so we can hook people up to something that measures their galvanic skin response. And galvanic skin response is basically, when your nervous system kicks up from like an emotional response, you start sweating, and this galvanic skin response can measure the conductivity on your skin. And so when you hook people up to this galvanic skin meter, they've done experiments where they show people like a picture of a stranger's face or body and face, and then a picture of someone they recognize, either for good or bad. And they'll show that although they say both of the people in the pictures are strangers, when they show the person that's familiar to them, you'll see an increase in their galvanic skin response, which is suggesting that the person is at some level unconsciously processing that they know who this person is, despite the fact that they cannot tell you who it is, and they consciously think they do not know who that person is. But their body is actually having a reaction, right, that we can measure that tells us that they do recognize that person at some level. Again, this is the idea that there can be multiple information streams, those of which we're conscious of and those that we're not conscious of. There's also a famous example of this thing called a P3B wave. And the P3B wave is an event-related potential in a famous oddball experiment. It's thought to be a marker for attention because, right, our brains are designed to put more attention towards rare or novel stimuli. And so when we say oddball, we mean a surprise which captures your attention, right? Something rare or novel. It's the oddball. And here is a graph depicting a P3B wave what you're seeing is amplitude of an EEG signal on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. 0 would be stimulus onset, and you can see 175 milliseconds after stimulus onset. You can see that both the frequent and rare stimulus are eliciting some sort of response. And you'll see it increases about 200 milliseconds out. But you'll see that the rare stimulus, this orange line here, actually has a slightly increased amplitude compared to the frequent stimulus. And this is actually a statistically significant increase. And so the idea here is that the brain is responding more to rare or oddball stimuli because that type of information is really important to the brain. So that is the P3B wave. The orange one is the P3B wave. Now, Silverstein in 2015 did a study in which they claimed P3B waves, these oddball, right, markers of attention, this increased amplitude EEG signal, was present despite subjects lacking conscious awareness that a stimulus was there or a rare stimulus was presented, but their brain was still processing it and having this elevated response. They were able to do this by limiting the time. So basically, they were flashing a bunch of stimuli on the screen. They could be flashing the same thing like a ball over and over, but they were flashing at approximately 7 milliseconds, which they claimed allowed this stimulus to avoid conscious detection. And so the idea here is that you would show something that was frequent, like just a beach ball, right? And then maybe after 10 flashes, boom, you get like a big gorilla or something, right? This different rare stimulus. And that, right, gorilla in this example would elicit this increased EEG response called the P3B wave. But the individual had no idea that they were seeing a rare stimulus. So again, just another example that there can be information being processed in the brain that we are not aware of. Another example I want to share with you guys is this thing called colostomy. And this is a surgical procedure to sever the corpus callosum. Hopefully you remember the corpus callosum is this big fiber bundle connecting the two hemispheres of the brain in this image. It's this middle area. And it's just cut out in the surgical procedure, effectively disconnecting the two hemispheres of the brain. And this is most often done in instances of severe epilepsy. But again, it disconnects the two hemispheres, and this results in what have been coined split brain patients. And importantly, I want to remind you guys, I'm sure you know this, that your left visual field, you can see there's a square here being seen by this left eye, and the left visual field actually projects to your right hemisphere. That's why the square is over here in this image. And your right visual field, things in your right visual field are projected to your left hemisphere. There's a splitting right there, right, at the optic chiasm. And things are put to the other brain area, other hemisphere. Keep that in mind here as I talk about this experiment. So this has been done. Real studies have been done on this. And it's that if you have a split brain patient sitting at a desk, and on the right side, which would be their right visual field, you put the word face. And then one other thing you should know is that the left hemisphere is dominant for verbal processing. So if you ask this person what they see, they will tell you face. I see the word face. Now, if you put the word face in their left visual field, and remember, the right hemisphere is not dominant for verbal processing. If you ask the person to say what they see, they'll say nothing, right? Because this over here, this right visual field projecting to our verbal hemisphere is not seeing anything. So that's their response. But you could ask the person to draw something, right? And so actually the right hemisphere is going to allow them to draw it, and they could draw the face. So here's an example of where Christoph Kochs talked about these split brain patients a lot of consciousness researchers, because some people think that when you sever the corpus callosum, you may effectively be creating two different consciousnesses, right? So this gives the idea that there's something about connectivity that may be involved in consciousness. Now, these people undoubtedly still share things like the brainstem, right? Pons, medulla, those types of core things regulating their nervous systems and bodily functions, but the cortical areas are definitely disconnected. And you know, it's a question that people put out there. Are you effectively making two consciousnesses here? And because one hemisphere is completely unaware of what's happening in the other. All right, let's talk about some other lesions and disconnections. So for example, the cerebellum, your little brain in the back of your head, right? Lesions to the cerebellum do not affect consciousness, despite the cerebellum having 4 times more neurons than the cortex. It's crazy. So what does this mean? This means that having more neurons doesn't necessarily correlate with more consciousness. I was just reading an interview with Christoph Koch before this, and he was talking about this exact thing. He's like, absolutely not. More neurons does not mean you're more conscious. In fact, what it is that it is either the architecture or wiring that's of your neurons that seems to play a role in consciousness. And some of the theories I'm going to talk to you about in a bit are actually focused around trying to understand what type of wiring will allow an individual or organism to become conscious. Some lesions that can affect consciousness, for example, the brainstem. If you knock out the brainstem, you know, you're not only affecting consciousness, but you could also mess with like core bodily functions like regulating your heart rate or breathing, right? And that would not be good at all too. But brainstem will definitely make you unconscious. But also other cortical regions, right? These can affect consciousness. So Christoph Koch, and I'll talk more about this posterior hot zone, but he thinks, right, this is like your temporal parietal areas, that you can stimulate these areas or take them out, and you can take out at least one piece of your conscious experience, right? One of those contents. If I take out your visual cortex, right, you no longer have a experience of a visual field, but you could have others, right? Auditory and stuff like that. Now, this is where some of the theories are split. Again, I'll talk about this, but other theories focus on frontal cortices and think that those are actually areas that are most important for consciousness. So let's get into some of these theories. So I'm going to give you 2 main theories, and because these are the ones that I keep hearing about all over, and I've actually attended Christoph Koch's one of his lectures at UW last year, and these are the 2 he's always talking about. And just fun fact, he's the one, he supports IIT theory more than anything, but global workspace theory is the competing theory, and both of these have a mountain of information from neuroscience supporting them. Okay, so global workspace theory, or GWT, sometimes called global neuronal workspace theory, describes that consciousness is an epiphenomena of broadcasted information, and I'm going to show you an image of this in just a second. But one key difference between the 2 is that global workspace theory posits that frontal cortices are necessary to conscious experience. It is often criticized for its focus on input-output feed-forward systems. But a cool thing is that it predicts robots may one day become conscious. Very interesting. The other one, IIT theory, integrated information theory, says consciousness is designed into the system, and it emphasizes recurrent connections with causal power, right? This is talking about recurrent connections. These are connections that, right, a piece of information gets fed through a system, but then there are connections that allow it to come back to the beginning and then change and exert a causal influence to change the system itself. That's what it's talking about. And this is where we get into the architecture of the brain, that it needs to be wired in such a way that it can come back and affect itself versus just being an input-out system at which something just comes in, gets processed, and goes out. In IIT theory, Christoph Koch talks about the posterior hot zone and that it's necessary for consciousness. So that's a major difference. GWT talks about frontal cortices. Integrated information theory talks about posterior hot zone, which is more in the back of your brain. Interestingly, it's criticized for being a form of panpsychism, meaning it thinks consciousness is actually in everything. But it also predicts robots will never become conscious. And so one of the talks that I attended from Christoph Koch is he was all excited that he's trying to create a paper and do a study where they put these 2 theories head to head, and because they really want to know if robots will or will not become conscious, right? There's ethical implications. So let me give you a little more detail on each of these. So global workspace theory, again, is this idea that conscious emerges when information is broadcasted to the global workspace. So in general, you have this input of sensory data. When the sensory data gets put into the global workspace, it is broadcasted to other brain areas and you become conscious of it. And really what it's saying is that consciousness is an epiphenomena of neural processing, and it relies on the frontal cortex. This is this right here is a diagram that's been around since 1998. And what it's showing is that you'll see there's this global workspace. And what it says is that there's these other processing modules outside of the global workspace, like ones for long-term memory, there's evaluative systems, there's perceptual systems and motor systems and attention systems, okay? And these modules can all be doing their own thing, and you will be completely unaware of it. But only when this information is put into the global workspace are you now conscious of it. Let me give you an example of this that actually makes a lot of sense. And it's that think back to when you were learning how to drive. When you were learning how to drive, I remember, at least myself, I had to think a lot about, like very carefully pressing on the gas pedal gradually, right? And very carefully pressing the brake pedal, right? Because at first I'd hit a stop sign, my mom's in the passenger seat, and it's like, psh, psh, right? And my mom's like, Kevin, you got to stop, right? And so I had to think a lot about that. And so the idea here, as you were learning to drive, your perceptual systems were broadcasting information to your global workspace. You're very conscious of it, focusing on trying to be a better driver, and then it was outputted to the motor systems, right? But today, and I'm sure it's probably like many of you, today, I don't have to think twice about any of that stuff, right? I can just go to a stop sign. I don't even realize that hopefully you realize that you're stopping, but it's really easy, right? I don't have to think about how hard I'm hitting the pedal, either the gas or brake pedal. I don't have to think about a lot of maneuvers I do, turn signal. It's just automatic, right? I just flip the turn signal. And the idea here is that once something becomes so learned and engraved, there's actually, so in the perceptual system, there's like neural pathways that grow, and it shortcuts going to the global workspace. It no longer needs to, and it just goes straight to the motor system, right? And I think, so therefore, through time, it was almost like this global workspace was only needed in the beginning, and as you become really good at things and they become autonomic, you can just bypass the global workspace, right? And just, what to do. Your sensory system here, your perception system is just sending that information to the motor system. The wiring's already in place and you know what to do, okay? And there are many examples of this, and it actually fits with a lot of experimental evidence of how memory is formed, right? It becomes more distributed through time throughout your brain. This other diagram here is just kind of an extension of this. You can see all these little nodes in these lines. They're actually exactly the same as the global workspace here. I'll let you notice that. And so what it's doing is giving you an example of the frontal cortex and layers 2 and 3 here, and there's a sensory cortex. And again, I said global workspace theory focuses on the frontal cortex. And the idea here is that the frontal cortex is the one that's really needed to help send it to the global workspace. And once something goes to the global workspace, you can have some sort of sensory, understanding, like, you can have this, you can know there's a coffee there, right? But it wasn't until this information was broadcasted through the whole brain that you were really aware of it, okay? The other theory, integrated information theory. This theory is based on computational models to determine how information is integrated into neural systems that have sufficient architecture, i.e. those recurrent connections I was talking about. And a big claim of this theory is that consciousness is fundamental to living matter. Here's an idea here. So in this example, you can see, right? So the blue area, right, that with GWT, we're in the frontal cortex. Now it actually thinks that a lot of the things necessary for conscious experience are in the back here, this posterior hot zone. And you can see this diagram. You have the input of sensory data, information, and visual field, your auditory stuff. And it's going into this neural network. Hopefully you see this neural network's a lot different than the other one. There's, right, all these nodes are interconnected. This is a very important piece of this theory, and that you can see there's arrows going around and they're coming back and influencing themselves. And it says here, network that influences itself experiences consciousness. So, right, these recurrent connections are critical to this theory. Now, while it claims that consciousness is fundamental to living matter, it does say that, the degree of consciousness varies, right? And that it says that kind of humans may have such a high level of consciousness that it's just like, it's not even on the same level as the worm. But it is saying at some level the worm has some consciousness. And all right. So it does this by quantitatively describing consciousness using the symbol phi. Phi is the symbol for the amounts of integrated information in a system. So the idea here is that, from their computational models, they've come up with a way to calculate the level of integrated information, the level of phi. And what they're saying is that even in a worm, there is some level of phi. Although our phi is like just way more bigger, like in a totally different realm than this, okay? And that this phi is the level of consciousness. So the assumption is that consciousness is correlated with phi. But this is the first piece this is like the first theory to start to get at that there's degrees of consciousness. And if there's degrees of consciousness, can we measure them? Okay, so I talked about this area called the posterior hot zone. This is tied in with integrative information theory that Christoph Koch is a huge proponent of. And the posterior hot zone is thought to be the cortical area thought to play a large role in conscious perception. It's highlighted in red here. And you notice that the frontal lobe here is not highlighted because IIT theory does not believe it's a very important to conscious experience. But the red area includes the parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. And they claim this is important to conscious experience because electrical stimulation of this area produces a wide range of sensations and feelings, ultimately altering or distorting consciousness. And Christoph Koch claims that stimulation of the frontal cortex usually does not change experience. Now, a really cool method that came out of the IIT theories postulates, right, and all their math, is they came up with this thing called the zap and zip method, which is an actual consciousness meter. And so they've actually been doing, they actually were doing some preliminary studies on this method. And the idea here, first, I want to remind you that about what TMS is. TMS, transmagnetic stimulation. And in TMS, you have these magnetic coils. They call this a wand often. And it's sending these targeted magnetic pulses into your brain. And if you know anything about electromagnetism, you know that their electricity and magnetism is related. So we send magnetic currents into the brain, focus pieces of this magnetism to the brain, to targeted brain areas, and we can effectively distort or stimulate these brain areas and stimulate electrical activity to happen. All right, and it's TMS. Here's an example of being used in a clinical application. It's used for a lot of disorders. They've had a lot of good results with like major depressive disorder, for example, with TMS, and leaving that. But so they use TMS in the zap and zip method. And the idea here is that they use TMS to perturb neural systems, and then they record that perturbation caused by TMS with EEG. Okay. The reason they're doing this is that the integrated information theory predicts a system's level of phi will influence the resulting perturbations from the TMS pulses. So here's an example of a brain that's highly integrated. It would have a high level of phi. Here you have a low integration brain, which has a low level of phi. And the idea here is that when you send a pulse, let's think about the low integration brain here first. We send this TMS pulse in there. A low integrated brain should have, kind of like dropping a stone in a puddle of water, you'll see waves ripple out, right? So when you send that TMS pulse to this low phi brain, you're going to see a big wave resulting from the TMS. This perturbation will be big. But in the highly integrated brain, when you send that TMS pulse, you're not going to see as many ripples. It's kind of like dropping a stone in a standing pool of water. You're going to see a lot of ripples. But if you were to drop that stone in a raging river, you're barely going to see, you're going to see like one splash, right? You're not going to see ripples going all out. That's the same idea here. And so what they're able to do is by analyzing the perturbations caused by TMS, they think they're allowing them to assess the level of consciousness in a person, because it's supposed to be related to phi, the level of connectivity and the integrated information in the brain. This is effectively creating a scale of consciousness, and it is measured in what they call the PCI, the Perturbational Complexity Index, okay? And they've actually been doing a real study on this. They had 81 patients who were unconscious or in a vegetative state, and they were, 90% of the time they were able to identify whether the person was conscious or unconscious. So pretty cool stuff. Hopefully they'll start to use this in the future. But again, like IIT theory, the reason why I've been such a big proponent of it is that it's led us to the first way to quantify consciousness using the zap and zip method. Now, I'm going to leave you with one more example of really new research, but first about what consciousness could be. But first, I want to remind you guys of this thing called a temporal circuit. So I know Sherry's shown you guys that creativity seems to be, right, your cognitive ability of creativity seems to involve this interplay of 3 different networks switching in and out from each other, okay? The default mode network, the executive control network, and the visual network. And all 3 of these have to, right, the brain has to switch between them and through time. This we can call a temporal circuit, okay? So the claim here is that activity levels of discrete brain areas, right? Just looking at the activity in your frontal cortex or even in the posterior hot zone, that's not enough maybe to define consciousness. Maybe consciousness relies on the ability of a brain to switch between different networks in and out in a temporal circuit, okay? So there's a study that was released almost exactly a year ago, and it was titled The Temporal Circuit of Macroscale Dynamic Brain Activity Supports Human Consciousness. And in this study, they analyzed the resting state fMRI in 98 patients, and they analyzed resting state in 4 conditions. So one condition was this conscious resting states, right? It was conscious individuals. And then they had 3 other conditions of people who they were measuring their unresponsive resting states. So 2 of these were induced by drugs, right? One was propofol, another was ketamine. And these, when administered in high amounts, create a state of what appears to be unconscious or unresponsiveness, as they call it. And the other is unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, which is very similar to the locked-in syndrome that I was talking to you about earlier. All right, so they have these people, they have 4 different categories. 3 of them are different types of unconsciousness, basically, and they have conscious people, right? And they're looking at their fMRI. And the conclusion from this study was that human consciousness relies on a specific temporal circuit of dynamic brain activity between networks, and that limited access to the default mode network and dorsal attentional network appear to be common signatures of unresponsiveness. So what do we mean by that? Let me show you this data here. So here you have, in a conscious individual, you have 8 different networks, brain networks, okay, that are changing through time with one another. All right, so default mode network, that's this one. All right, DAT, dorsal attentional network. Okay, there's a visual network, and there's some other ones. And they are all somewhat connected with each other through time. And so the gray lines just indicate baseline. Of course, the conscious individual, everything's baseline. So they then look at the unconscious individuals. So let's look at the unresponsive wakefulness syndrome individuals. And look, you can already see that through time, these 8 different networks, right, there's a lot less arrows connecting them, meaning that there's probably less connections between them. Green actually means lower than baseline. So what you can see here is that a network can also have correlated activity with itself. and this one had lower than baseline correlated activity in the dorsal attentional network. And also there was lower correlated activity in the default mode network. There were a few heightened activity areas, but in general, it seems that the brain overall in these unconscious or these unresponsive wakefulness syndrome patients was less connected overall. Thus, was their conclusion that it seemed that limited access to the default mode network and dorsal attentional network appear to be common signatures of unresponsiveness. Now, we can talk about the two others types of unresponsiveness that were induced by drugs. Propofol, you can see there's a lot of green arrows, so there's a lot less correlated activity of networks onto themselves, but there also seems to be less overall activity in a lot of other areas. There is some higher, but overall, way less on themselves. In ketamine individuals, you can see all these red lines, so there's actually a lot of higher than baseline activity, even though these individuals were unresponsive. The reason they think, so ketamine is a little bit different of a drug than propofol, right? Some will even say it has these dissociative, sometimes hallucinogenic aspects to it. And it could be that this hyperconnectivity between some of these areas between each other and on each other actually is a reason for some of those kind of dissociative hallucinogenic properties of ketamine. But what you can see in each of these unresponsive conditions, right? This green means lower than baseline activity on the DMN, lower than baseline activity, correlated activity with the default dorsal attentional network. And you see that in each of these. So we have now just created possibly another way to have a consciousness meter to detect it. And it's by looking at how brain networks change through time with one another. And I think this is a really cool finding that I'm excited to see what goes further with this research. There are many more theories out there on consciousness. Some of them are crazy, some make sense, right? There's recurrent network theory. There's lots of theories talking about quantum mechanics. Some of them try to talk about the little microtubules that actually comprise neurons and their membranes, that they could have computations. And there's lots of other variations of IIT and global workspace theory. Okay, so that was a lot. Thanks for hanging in there with me, and I hope you found some of that interesting. And I'll be hanging around 10:15 to answer questions for you guys. So I hope to see some of you. And other than that, thanks for listening.